1974. The President of the United States resigns in disgrace, while a redacted agreement is signed in a sweltering room in Jeddah. Slam cut to June 9th, 2024. A digital calendar page tears away. There are no explosions, no breaking news alerts flashing across your screen. Just a silent, relentless ticking clock superimposed over the New York Stock Exchange. The absolute foundation of our economic reality just vanished, and you did not even hear a whisper. Right now, the purchasing power of your entire life savings is tethered to a ghost contract. Everything your high school economics textbook taught you is a comfortable lie. Your money is not backed by gold, nor the blind trust of the free market. For 50 years, the dollar was backed by a barrel of crude oil and a loaded gun. The petrodollar is dead. If you fail to grasp the physics of this collapse, your wallet is entirely exposed to a geopolitical earthquake that has already begun. I'm going to pull you behind the curtain of the global shadow economy. You are about to see the exact financial weaponry that built the modern world, and the mathematical glitch embedded in the very matrix of United States hegemony. The safety catch has just been flipped off. We are going to dissect the anatomy of this invisible empire, stripping away the political theater to reveal the raw mechanics of power. You are finally going to see the matrix of money exactly as it truly is. We descend into the pitch black of the Strait of Hormuz. A massive container ship, bloated with millions of gallons of unrefined sludge, slices silently through the dark water. Hovering just above the rusted deck is a glowing, pulsing digital web of international transactions. This invisible net stretches out across the frozen ocean, wiring this physical cargo directly to the digital ledger of a suburban bank branch in Ohio. This is the vulnerable vascular system of the planet. You have been programmed to look at that black sludge and see only fuel for your combustion engine. But that is a profound misconception. That oil is the literal physical backing of modern American currency. Every drop pumping through those steel veins is a highly weaponized financial instrument holding the Western world together. We are hovering over a planetary hostage situation, and you can practically feel the terrifying fragility of the tethers keeping the system from snapping. To understand the trap, we have to look at the underlying code of the global market. Until June 2024, nearly 80% of all global oil trades were forced to be settled exclusively in United States dollars. It did not matter if Japan was buying crude from Brazil or if India was importing energy from Nigeria. The transaction had to be filtered through the American banking system. It was an inescapable toll booth built into the architecture of human survival. The sheer audacity of this mechanism is paralyzing. The entire planet was trapped in a closed loop, desperately scrambling to acquire green pieces of paper just to keep their power grids from going dark. If you did not hold United States dollars, your nation simply starved. This was not a natural economic equilibrium born from the superiority of American innovation. It was a synthetic, mathematically engineered monopoly designed to drain the wealth of the developing world. This enforced, artificial demand created a brilliant, devastating anomaly. Because every nation on Earth was forced to stockpile American currency, they essentially paid a hidden tax to the United States just to keep their lights on. You were told that inflation is a natural byproduct of a growing economy. That is a lie. Inflation is the shadow tax we exported to the rest of the globe. We printed the money, and the global South absorbed the devastating economic impact. When a factory worker in Jakarta paid twice as much for a loaf of bread, They were unknowingly subsidizing a suburban mortgage in California. The global economy was never a free market. It was a mandatory subscription service to the American empire. The sheer volume of this capital leak is staggering. Trillions of dollars flowed through this invisible pipeline, propping up a standard of living that the physical output of the United States could not mathematically justify. We are looking at a system so deeply embedded in our collective psychology that we forgot it was a temporary arrangement. The entire algorithmic trading infrastructure of the 21st century was built on the assumption that this artificial demand would last forever. But geopolitical laws are just as ruthless as physics. The sudden disappearance of this forced dollar dependency is mathematically equivalent to removing gravity from the solar system. Without the gravitational pull of the petrodollar, the orbits of global trade are violently snapping out of alignment. The models on the screens of macroeconomic forecasters are flashing red because the fundamental equation of wealth has been broken. When you suddenly unpeg the anchor of global energy from a fiat currency, the entire matrix of international debt begins to unravel at the speed of light. We are watching a 50-year-old financial reactor initiate a catastrophic core meltdown. This is not abstract theory happening in a vacuum. This is a highly targeted attack on the purchasing power of your paycheck. The artificial sponge that absorbed our infinite money printing has been wrung dry, and all those trillions of exported dollars are preparing to flood back to our shores. The institutions you trust to manage this crisis are operating blindly, using maps drawn for a world that ceased to exist the moment that secret 50-year contract quietly expired in the desert. You have to ask yourself why the architects of this system went to such extreme, covert lengths to tie a piece of paper to a barrel of crude. The official narrative claims it was a natural evolution of global finance to stabilize volatile markets in the 1970s, but the math tells a much darker, much more desperate story. They did not link the dollar to oil from a position of strength. They executed this master stroke from a position of sheer, unadulterated panic. We have accepted an illusion so total, so perfectly constructed, that we forgot to look at the raw physical materials keeping us alive. A barrel of oil represents millions of years of condensed solar energy, capable of moving mountains and fueling armadas. Yet, we traded it for digits on a screen that can be fabricated by the trillions with a single keystroke at the Federal Reserve. It is an impossible exchange rate that defies the most basic laws of thermodynamic reality. Which brings us to the ultimate, terrifying anomaly at the heart of the modern world. It is the paradox of value that Wall Street prays you never begin to question. Why exactly does a piece of green paper, decorated with the faces of dead presidents, get to dictate the price of the physical energy that keeps billions of human beings alive? To understand the ghost contract of 2024, we must first investigate the spectacular crime scene of 1971. Step into the subterranean vault of the Federal Reserve. To the geo-financial archivist standing in this concrete tomb, the silence of the gold reserves is deafening. Behind these thick steel doors lies the physical wealth of a nation, locked away and rendered entirely obsolete. This is not a museum of American prosperity. This is ground zero for the greatest financial illusion ever pulled on the human race. A bait-and-switch that reprogrammed your reality. Look at the sheer physical mass of those gold bars. For decades, that heavy, unyielding metal was the only reason your money meant anything at all. Every printed dollar was essentially a claim check for a fraction of that gold. It was a mathematical tether to physical reality, preventing governments from simply printing infinite wealth. But the archivist reviewing the classified ledgers of 1971 sees the fatal flaw. The empire was spending blood and treasure it did not actually possess. The math of the Cold War and the Vietnam conflict had finally caught up with Washington. Foreign nations, realizing the deficit, demanded their gold back. The Treasury was bleeding physical assets at a terminal velocity. This brings us to the ultimate betrayal, the moment the United States defaulted on its global obligations and turned money into an absolute illusion. The political elite did not admit defeat. Instead, they changed the fundamental laws of economic physics. On August 15, 1971, the United States unilaterally abandoned the gold standard. With a single televised broadcast, the executive branch severed the dollar from physical reality. This was not a minor policy adjustment. It was an act of extreme desperation, a geopolitical default hidden behind the sterile bureaucratic term known as the Nixon Shock. The tether was cut, and the currency you use every single day was violently launched into the void. The archivist flips through the panicked internal memos of the era, watching the mechanical roar of the printing presses replace the silent weight of the gold. Once you remove the physical limit on currency, the printing press never stops. The government granted itself the power to create infinite liquidity out of thin air. But the universe demands balance, and you cannot cheat the laws of thermodynamics. When you print value from nothing, you steal it from the future. Overnight, the dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by absolutely nothing but institutional violence and blind faith. The immediate consequence was a brutal economic panic. By the mid-70s, inflation skyrocketed to terrifying double digits. The purchasing power of the middle class was vaporized in real time. The numbers on the grocery store receipts doubled, stripping away the wealth of ordinary citizens to pay for the reckless debts of the political class. Your high school textbooks probably fed you a sanitized version of this era, blaming oil embargoes and unions for the crisis. The archivist knows that official narrative is a carefully constructed myth. The inflation was a direct mathematical consequence of the fiat system. When the money supply expands infinitely, the value of your labor collapses. You were programmed to accept a 2% annual loss of your wealth as a normal economic weather pattern. It is not normal. Through the lens of cold financial forensics, the situation in the late 1970s was apocalyptic. The dollar was in a freefall, rejected by international markets that saw right through the newly minted paper illusion. The global trust required to sustain a fiat currency was evaporating instantly. The United States was hemorrhaging economic authority, bleeding out on the global stage as the mathematical reality of unbacked debt finally crushed the American dream. Without a hard physical asset to anchor the global reserve currency, the American empire was mathematically scheduled to collapse from hyperinflation within a single decade. The internal projections from the Treasury Department were flashing red, predicting a total breakdown of civil society as the currency reached its intrinsic value of zero. The printing press, intended to be a weapon of infinite power, had mutated into a suicide vest strapped to the domestic economy. You have to grasp the sheer terror echoing through the halls of power during those years. The leaders of the free world were staring down the barrel of a Weimar Republic scenario. If a loaf of bread costs $50 one week and $500 the next, the social contract disintegrates. The archivist traces the paper trail of panic, noting how desperate men search for impossible solutions when the survival of their entire geopolitical hegemony is mere months away from total ruin. You might think that a superpower facing imminent bankruptcy would rein in its spending, balance the budget, and return to physical reality. That is the rational assumption of a responsible citizen. But empires do not retreat. They double down on the gamble. The architects of this crisis realized they could not go back to gold. They needed something universally demanded, something every nation on Earth required to keep its engines running and its populations alive. They needed a new hostage. If the dollar was no longer backed by shiny metal sitting in a subterranean vault, it had to be backed by the raw kinetic energy of civilization itself. The archivist closes the ledger on 1971 and pulls the classified files of 1974. The solution they found was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely dependent on a geographical region thousands of miles away from the Federal Reserve. To halt the terminal velocity of the fiat dollar, Washington had to invent a synthetic demand for its paper. They needed an asset so crucial that foreign central banks would be forced to stockpile American debt forever. This is the exact moment the financial matrix you live in was truly born. We are about to leave the cold vaults of New York and step into the scorching heat of the desert, where a single, quiet handshake would successfully hold the entire planet ransom. With the gold gone and inflation burning through the populace like a localized financial plague, we need to know exactly what replaced the anchor to stop the freefall. You were taught that economies recover through sheer industry and innovation. You were lied to. When the mathematical reality of a collapsing fiat currency sets in, a dying superpower does not build factories. It builds a trap. The architects of this trap had to look far beyond the Rust Belt to find their salvation. We leave the cold, empty subterranean vaults of New York behind and step into an opulent, smoke-filled room in Jeddah. The year is 1974. The air conditioning hums against the brutal desert heat outside. A heavy fountain pen scratches across a heavily redacted diplomatic document. To the untrained eye, this is just another dry geopolitical summit. But look closer. That ink bleeding into the paper is about to rewrite the gravitational laws of global wealth for the next 50 years. The camera pushes past the shoulders of the men at the table, diving straight into the wet ink of the signature, plunging us into a swirling digital galaxy of green numbers representing infinite debt. This visualizes the ultimate macroeconomic paradox of our time. I have a question for you, one that defies all conventional logic. How do you save a global empire that possesses absolutely zero money? The answer is ruthless and elegant. You borrow the entire world's most valuable commodity. Your high school textbooks claim the United States dollar remained powerful because of the sheer strength of the American consumer. That is a comforting fairy tale. The truth is far more cynical. The dollar survived because of a geopolitical hostage situation constructed right here in this smoke-filled room in Saudi Arabia. The men signing this document are not fixing an economy. They are hacking the global energy grid to force an artificial demand for their increasingly worthless paper. In the sweltering heat of 1974, recently appointed Treasury Secretary William Simon arrived in Jeddah to orchestrate a highly classified financial pact. He was not a diplomat. He was a ruthless Wall Street bond trader given a single, impossible directive by the president: neutralize the economic death spiral. Simon understood that whoever controls the pricing mechanism of energy controls the destiny of civilization. He proposed a monopoly that would shock the modern world. The terms Simon laid out in that room were breathtaking in their audacity. Saudi Arabia would agree to price all of its oil exports exclusively in United States dollars. Not gold, not British pounds, not a basket of global currencies, only the American dollar. If a nation in Europe or Asia wanted to power its hospitals, run its military, or harvest its crops, it first had to acquire American paper. Overnight, the black blood of the earth became strictly tethered to the green fiat of Washington.
This was not a trade agreement. It was the installation of a global toll booth. By forcing the world to buy energy in a single fiat currency, Simon artificially resurrected the dead American dollar. You must grasp the sheer scale of this manipulation. The United States suddenly possessed the exclusive franchise on the currency required for human survival. But a monopoly of this magnitude requires extreme enforcement. A simple signature on a piece of paper is never enough to hold the globe hostage. A sovereign nation does not simply surrender its pricing power out of goodwill. In exchange for this exclusive dollar pricing, the United States provided something Saudi Arabia desperately needed: the ultimate impenetrable shield of American military protection. The entire arsenal of the United States Armed Forces effectively became the private security detail for the Saudi oil fields. Weapons, intelligence, and a guarantee of dynastic survival were all placed on the geopolitical table. This transaction permanently altered the DNA of modern money. When the ink dried on that redacted document in 1974, the United States dollar was no longer a gold-backed currency. It had successfully transformed into a military-backed currency. The value of the cash in your wallet stopped being derived from a precious metal in a vault. It was now underwritten by the raw, kinetic threat of aircraft carriers and smart bombs patrolling the strategic waters of the Persian Gulf.
Think about the absolute genius of this pivot. The American empire replaced the finite limitation of physical gold with the infinite projection of military violence. You were never told that the stability of your mortgage rate and the price of your groceries depended on fighter jets enforcing a pricing mechanism in the Middle East. It is a stunning realization. But the architects of this system were not finished. They needed to solve the problem of the massive, unpayable American debt. The final clause of the Jeddah Agreement is what truly locked the mathematical trap. Saudi Arabia was about to drown in an ocean of American dollars, accumulating vast surpluses of cash from the rest of the world. William Simon ensured they agreed to take those billions of petrodollars and quietly reinvest them directly back into United States Treasury bonds. They took their oil profits and used them to secretly finance America's exploding sovereign debt, funding the very empire that protected them. Watch the swirling green numbers of our digital galaxy accelerate. The loop is now closed. The United States prints paper out of thin air to buy oil. Saudi Arabia takes that paper and loans it right back to the United States government with interest. The American Treasury uses those loaned funds to build more weapons to protect the oil fields. It is a perpetual motion machine of debt, a breathtaking financial Ouroboros entirely insulated from the laws of normal economics. This 50-year bluff became the invisible architecture of your entire financial life. The American government discovered they could print infinite currency without immediate consequence because the Petrodollar agreement forced the rest of the planet to absorb the shock. The Handshake in Jeddah guaranteed that the consequences of Washington's spending would not fall on the American taxpayer, but would instead be systematically extracted from the global South. The weapon was fully armed. This single handshake forced the entire planet to subsidize the American way of life. Step into the cold reality of a high-frequency trading server farm. The macroeconomist stands surrounded by rows of blinking blades, deafened by the roar of industrial cooling systems. This is the physical engine of the shadow economy. Your high school economics teacher lied to you about inflation. They taught you it was a natural byproduct of growth, a simple equation of supply and demand. They were fundamentally wrong. Through the eyes of the forecaster watching these fiber optic cables pulse with light, inflation is not a force of nature. It is a weaponized export. We are tracking a mathematical anomaly that defies every law of traditional finance. Look at the raw data flowing through these servers. The United States government runs a multi-trillion-dollar deficit, yet the dollar does not immediately collapse. It is the ultimate infinite money glitch. How do you print trillions without destroying your own economy? The answer lies in the geopolitical hostage situation created back in 1974. You cannot simply print wealth out of thin air unless someone else is forced to absorb the mathematical damage. And the weapon they used to enforce this absorption is the very energy grid that keeps modern civilization breathing. Here is the brutal reality of the global matrix. Because every nation on Earth absolutely needs oil to survive, every central bank is forced to hold billions of United States dollars in their foreign exchange reserves. From Tokyo to Buenos Aires, if a country wants to keep its lights on, it must hoard American paper. The forecaster watches a tidal wave of red data wash across the monitors, representing these mandatory dollar acquisitions. This forced hoarding is not a choice. It is a geopolitical mandate enforced by the threat of darkness. Every developing nation is systematically stripped of its own wealth to purchase the right to participate in the global energy market. This artificial global demand acts as a massive financial sponge. It is perfectly designed to absorb the trillions of dollars the Federal Reserve prints out of thin air. When Washington decides to fund a new war or bail out a failing bank, the newly minted currency does not immediately flood the streets of New York. Instead, it is pushed overseas. You were programmed to believe that American prosperity was simply the result of superior innovation and hard work. The statistics lie. The blinking red servers confirm a far more parasitic reality. The American standard of living has been mathematically subsidized by the sweat and labor of the poorest people on the planet. The United States essentially exports its inflation to the rest of the world. By forcing developing nations to absorb the excess dollar supply, Washington makes global citizens pay for American domestic spending. When the printing press runs hot in the Eccles building, it is the factory worker in Mumbai who suddenly cannot afford to buy bread. The cables pulsing with light are not just transmitting trade data. They are siphoning time and human energy. Money is condensed human labor. When the Federal Reserve dilutes the money supply, they are actively stealing the past labor of billions of people trapped in the petrodollar matrix. It is a silent, algorithmic extraction of global wealth. The forecaster stares at the relentless influx of red algorithms and realizes the terrifying vulnerability of this architecture. It requires absolute obedience. The entire United States economy is precariously balanced on the assumption that foreign central banks will forever continue to buy our debt and absorb our financial toxicity. But mathematical laws cannot be suspended forever. The sponge is completely saturated. The Third World is drowning in the exported inflation of the First World, and the strain on the fiber optic network is reaching a critical breaking point. The invisible empire is running out of foreign populations to tax. This parasitic loop only functions as long as the world has no other choice. It is a system built on coercion, not trust. And as the forecaster watches the global debt counters tick upward into the hundreds of trillions, the inevitable question arises. What happens
when the hostages finally figure out how to build a bypass road. So, how do the hostages escape? They cannot simply walk away because the perimeter is lined with invisible tripwires. Having built this unseen empire of exported inflation, we must look at how it was weaponized into a geopolitical gun. Inside a secure clearing room in Brussels, a macroeconomic forecaster stares at a standard SWIFT banking terminal. To the untrained eye, it is just a portal for moving capital. But you have been programmed to believe a myth. Your high school textbook told you that global banking is a neutral infrastructure, a digital ocean where money flows freely according to the laws of supply and demand. You were wrong. The forecaster watches an operator type a routine sovereign transfer request. He hits enter. The screen instantly flashes a stark red error code. Access denied. What happens when the bank becomes a battlefield? We are witnessing the weaponization of the dollar in real time. That flashing red text is not a glitch in the software. It is the digital erasure of an entire nation-state. In a fraction of a second, a country is excommunicated from the global economy, unable to buy medicine, sell grain, or pay for the energy required to keep its citizens alive. To understand the sheer scale of this invisible artillery, you must look at the firing mechanism. The SWIFT system processes over 42 million messages a day. It is the central nervous system of global commerce, routing trillions of dollars across borders. But this network is not a neutral post office. It is a heavily guarded checkpoint, meticulously monitored by United States intelligence to enforce global hegemony. Every major transaction, every barrel of oil bought, every microchip sold, passes through the server farms of Western finance. The forecaster knows that whoever controls this routing protocol holds the ultimate geopolitical kill switch. For decades, the threat of flipping that switch was enough to keep the global South obediently holding American debt. The gun was pointed, but the trigger was rarely pulled. Then came the tipping point. The moment the theoretical threat became a terrifying, undeniable reality. In 2022, the United States and its allies executed the most devastating financial strike in human history. With a few keystrokes, they froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. There were no boots on the ground, no hypersonic missiles launched into the atmosphere. The money simply ceased to exist. You must understand the sheer mathematical horror of this event. $300 billion, representing decades of human labor, physical exports, and sovereign wealth, evaporated from the ledger. The forecaster looks at the denied access prompt and realizes the profound psychological damage inflicted. The fundamental law of property rights had just been aggressively rewritten. This unprecedented financial strike sent a terrifying, unmistakable signal to the global South, to every nation operating outside the immediate orbit of Washington. The message was brutally clear. Your money is only yours until the United States says otherwise. If you step out of line, your sovereign wealth can be turned off like a light switch. The underlying asset of the modern world is not gold. It is compliance. We are analyzing the exact moment the American financial empire crossed the event horizon. If this scale of geopolitical engineering blows your mind, hit the like button. If you want to survive the economic shockwave that is currently ripping through the markets, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. And tell me in the comments, would you keep your life savings in a bank that could arbitrarily delete your account? Of course you would not, and neither would the central banks of the developing world.
The forecaster understands the fatal error in this geopolitical strategy. By weaponizing the reserve currency, the United States broke the singular psychological element required for fiat money to function. They shattered the illusion of absolute trust. You can force a nation to use your currency, but you cannot force them to trust it. A financial panic does not always look like screaming traders on a trading floor. Sometimes, it looks like total silence. The freezing of those assets was the catalyst, triggering an immediate, desperate search for an alternative survival mechanism. The Global South looked at the flashing red terminal and realized that holding United States Treasury bonds was no longer a safe haven. It was a massive, unacceptable security risk. The weaponization of the dollar achieved its short-term tactical goal, but it activated a catastrophic long-term vulnerability. The forecaster pulls up a secondary monitor, tracking dark pool capital flows moving rapidly away from Western clearinghouses. The mathematical algorithm is shifting. Nations are quietly dumping their dollar reserves, buying physical gold, and hoarding raw commodities to escape the blast radius. The trap of the petrodollar is springing wide open. By demonstrating the absolute destructive power of financial excommunication, the United States accidentally gave the rest of the world the ultimate motive to build an escape route. The hostages are no longer just looking for a bypass road. They are actively laying the digital concrete for a new financial universe, one where the dollar has absolutely no jurisdiction. The Global South was already laying the digital concrete for an escape route, but they needed a structural weakness to break the perimeter. This heavily weaponized dollar system relied on exactly one load-bearing pillar of trust to maintain its gravitational pull, and we are about to watch that pillar quietly crumble. You are taught that empires fall to invading armies or nuclear fire, but the actual mathematics of collapse are far more mundane. Look at the geopolitical landscape on June 9, 2024. People are buying their morning coffee, walking their dogs, swiping their credit cards, completely oblivious to the massive, invisible fault line cracking beneath their feet. A ticking digital clock, set half a century ago in a smoke-filled room in Riyadh, finally hits zero. The timeline of American absolute hegemony simply runs out of sand, and nobody on the street notices a thing. The loudest explosion in global financial history was completely silent. To the geofinancial archivist sitting in a subterranean vault at the Bank for International Settlements, this silence is deafening. He tracks the expiration dates on declassified State Department cables from the 1970s. There are no sirens, no breaking news alerts interrupting your favorite broadcast. Just a cold, hard, contractual expiration that instantly rewrites the rules of wealth. Your high school textbooks programmed you to believe that the United States dollar is a permanent force of nature, like gravity or the tides. That is a comforting myth designed to keep you participating in a rigged economic matrix. The truth, sitting right there in the archivist's dusty folders, is that the petrodollar was a temporary geopolitical hack. It was a 50-year lease on global dominance, and the landlord just refused to hand over the keys for an extension. On that precise Sunday in June 2024, the bedrock of the modern global economy quietly pulverized into dust. The 50-year security agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia, the exact pact we investigated earlier, officially expired. For half a century, this single piece of paper forced the entire planet to buy American currency just to keep their industries powered. But this time, Riyadh purposefully left the renewal contract unsigned.
Through the eyes of the archivist, this unsigned document is a weapon of mass economic destruction. He compares the diplomatic transcripts of 1974 with the deafening silence of 2024. The American military umbrella is no longer enough to force Saudi compliance. The leverage is gone. You are watching the exact moment the United States lost its unilateral ability to hold the global energy market hostage. The bluff has officially been called. The fallout from this expired contract did not even wait for the ink to theoretically dry. Saudi Arabia immediately announced a paradigm-shattering shift in their monetary policy. They declared their absolute readiness to sell oil in multiple global currencies. They opened the floodgates to accept the Chinese yuan, the euro, and other regional tenders for the raw energy that runs human civilization. The exclusive toll booth that charged the world in dollars was violently dismantled.
Do not underestimate the sheer mathematical violence of this pivot. When a nation like Saudi Arabia accepts the Chinese yuan for crude oil, they bypass the New York clearinghouses entirely. The archivist traces the projected capital flows on his terminal, watching the traditional dollar recycling loop snap. This is not a gradual geopolitical drift. It is an immediate, calculated amputation of American financial oversight. The monopoly is effectively terminated. You probably assumed that inflation was just a natural byproduct of a growing economy, a slight tax you pay for living in the modern world. You were fundamentally wrong. Your relatively stable prices were subsidized by a global mandate that forced foreign central banks to absorb the inflation Washington printed. With Saudi Arabia accepting the euro and the yuan, the absolute monopoly of the dollar over the energy market evaporated overnight. When that monopoly vanished, it instantly severed the artificial, mandated demand that kept the American economy artificially afloat for 5 decades. Without the petrodollar mandate, there is zero mathematical reason for a bank in Brazil or a manufacturer in India to hold billions in United States Treasury bonds. The artificial sponge that soaked up the endless supply of newly minted American currency has been violently wrung out. Return to that ordinary street on June 9th. The person buying their morning coffee thinks their $5 bill holds intrinsic value because of the American flag printed on it. They do not realize that the structural floor beneath that currency has just dropped out. The archivist closes the file on 1974, fully aware that the geopolitical shockwave is already traveling through the financial crust, heading straight for your checking account. This is the terrifying reality of a fiat system stripped of its enforcement mechanism. We are not waiting for an economic collapse. We are currently living inside the free fall. The math is brutal, and it is entirely unforgiving. Without the forced global absorption of dollars, the fundamental laws of supply and demand are about to enact a ruthless revenge on the American middle class. You are holding shares in an empire that just lost its primary revenue stream. The expiration of this 50-year treaty was the starting gun for the greatest wealth transfer in human history. The United States financial matrix is suddenly leaking capital, influence, and time. But while the Western world continues to sleepwalk through this silent explosion, the global South is not just watching from the sidelines. They are already activating a parallel architecture, one designed to bypass the American banking system entirely and leave the dollar in the dark.
Nature abhors a vacuum, and the sudden expiration of that 50-year monopoly triggered the immediate, aggressive deployment of a shadow financial architecture. Look closely at the monitors inside this sleek, modern command center in Asia. The macroeconomic forecaster staring at these glowing nodes is not tracking a traditional market fluctuation. They are watching a live, real-time bypass operation. The Global South is systematically rewiring the planet's financial nervous system. On these massive screens, pulsing lines of data leap between continents. But if you look closely, you notice a glaring anomaly. The light trails completely bypass New York and London. It looks exactly like a neural network rapidly rewiring itself around a damaged lobe. Your history books taught you that empires fall through catastrophic military defeats. But how do you actually overthrow a global hegemon in the 21st century? You do not fight it. You simply build a bypass road. That bypass road has a specific, highly technical name: Project M-Bridge. What the forecaster sees on these monitors is a multi-central bank digital currency platform operating at blinding speed. This is not some speculative cryptocurrency experiment. It is a state-sponsored superhighway where massive cross-border trades are settled in seconds. The most terrifying part for Washington is that it executes these transfers without ever touching the United States dollar system. You were programmed to believe that Western clearinghouses were an inescapable monopoly. You thought every drop of oil had to pass through an American checkpoint. The data flowing across this Asian command center proves that assumption is mathematically dead. Project M-Bridge utilizes distributed ledger technology, allowing central banks to trade directly with one another. It removes the American middleman and, critically, the ability of the United States to monitor or sanction the transaction. Who is actually driving on this new digital superhighway? The expanded BRICS nations. The forecaster pulls up the aggregate data, and the sheer scale of the shift induces immediate vertigo. This coalition now controls over 40% of global oil production and nearly 30% of global gross domestic product. We are not talking about a fringe group of developing economies. This is a coordinated bloc possessing the raw physical commodities that the entire planet requires to survive. Your textbooks sold you a comfortable lie, claiming the nation with the most advanced financial derivatives holds ultimate power. The analyst staring at these raw production metrics knows the brutal truth. You cannot eat paper, and you cannot burn software to heat a home. When a coalition controlling 40% of the world's energy decides they no longer want your fiat currency, your complex financial engineering becomes worthless. True power has aggressively shifted back to physical reality. By combining massive commodity dominance with the lightning-fast architecture of Project M-Bridge, they achieved the mathematically impossible. They have effectively created a parallel financial universe. This new ecosystem is completely insulated from Western sanctions and impenetrable to the exported dollar inflation that plagued them for decades. The forecaster watches as billions in value change hands, completely invisible to regulatory agencies in Washington. The geopolitical weapon is neutralized. Think about what this insulation actually means for the global matrix. For 50 years, the United States printed trillions, and the world was forced to absorb the inflationary fallout just to buy petroleum. This parallel universe acts as a titanium firewall. When a nation trades oil for digital yuan over a decentralized ledger, they are explicitly rejecting the American inflation tax. The sponge we discovered earlier has not just been wrung out, it has been completely removed from the global sink. The true horror for the Western establishment is the flawless elegance of this transition. There are no dramatic declarations of war or explosive embargoes. The forecaster simply watches the transaction volume on the legacy systems slowly bleed out, transferring, drop by drop, into the glowing nodes of the new digital matrix. It is a silent, algorithmic run on the bank. The legacy empire is not being conquered by a foreign army. It is simply being optimized out of existence by better, faster code. With every passing second, another cargo ship of crude oil is settled outside the dollar's jurisdiction. Each of these transactions acts like a severed artery in the petrodollar body. You were conditioned to believe the United States dollar was a universal constant, much like gravity. But the data illuminating this Asian control room proves that currency gravity is entirely artificial. When you construct a faster, cheaper bypass road, the old imperial toll booth simply rusts away in the dark. This bypass road destroys more than just economic dominance. It actively blinds the intelligence apparatus. For decades, analyzing the dollar's movement allowed Western agencies to track every geopolitical maneuver. If you wanted to build a power plant or fund a revolution, Washington saw the receipt. Now, the forecaster watches entire economies transact in the absolute shadows of cryptographic privacy. The all-seeing eye of the Western financial system has essentially been gouged out overnight. The mathematical anomaly flashing across these monitors leads to a deeply disturbing question. If the global South is rapidly abandoning the greenback, what happens to the trillions of paper notes they currently hold in their central bank reserves? The forecasters' models show that money does not just evaporate into the ether. It is subject to the laws of financial physics. Every single dollar rejected by this new parallel universe is about to become highly radioactive cargo looking for a port. The glowing network of Project M-Bridge represents a sealed door to the rest of the world. Those trillions of discarded, newly homeless United States dollars have only one place left to go. They're going to turn around and flow directly back to the very place that printed them. The analyst realizes that the silent explosion in the East is about to trigger a catastrophic tidal wave in the West. The artificial dam has broken, and the deluge of 50 years of exported inflation is finally coming home. That tidal wave of exported inflation does not crash on the shores of Wall Street or the steps of the Capitol. It crashes right here, in the fluorescent-lit aisles of your local grocery store. I am watching the digital price tags on these shelves flicker and surge in real time, ticking upward like a malfunctioning gas pump. You were taught that inflation is just a natural byproduct of a growing economy. That is a comforting myth. What you are witnessing is a currency seeking asylum. For half a century, the United States printed trillions of paper notes, and the world was forced to absorb them to buy energy. But what happens when the globe suddenly refuses to play along? I call it the boomerang effect. The macroeconomic models are flashing a terrifying reality. If just 20% of global trade stops using the dollar, the mathematical dam bursts. Those trillions of unwanted digital and physical dollars are aggressively flooding back into the domestic economy. Look at the shopper standing next to me, staring blankly at a carton of eggs that just doubled in price. They think there is a supply chain issue or corporate greed at play. But the statistics lie, and the official narrative is designed to keep you docile. This is not about chickens or shipping containers. This is the raw physics of 50 years of weaponized monetary policy collapsing onto a single receipt. Every dollar rejected by the global South is actively diluting the money in your wallet. You thought you were insulated from the geopolitical chess game occurring in Asia, but this boomerang effect fundamentally rewrites the cost of your survival. As the artificial global demand for our currency evaporates, the purchasing power of the dollar plummets. This drastically increases the cost of every single imported good on these shelves. We are no longer exporting our inflation to developing nations.
We are violently importing the exact economic chaos we spent 50 years weaponizing. It is completely counterintuitive, but your paycheck is not shrinking because you are working less. Your labor is being actively stolen to balance a geopolitical ledger. The global financial matrix is purging the dollar, and the resulting pressure wave is blowing out the prices of bread, fuel, and medicine. The shopper at the register is swiping their card, entirely unaware that their life savings are being used to absorb the kinetic energy of a collapsing petrodollar empire. Which brings us to the ultimate paradox, the intellectual horror show hiding behind the polished doors of the Federal Reserve. They are trapped in a mathematical checkmate of their own design. The old monetary tricks are completely useless here. To absorb this returning tsunami of cash, they have exactly two options. They can raise interest rates to astronomical levels, which will instantly crush the domestic housing market and trigger a brutal depression. Or they choose the coward's way out. The alternative is to keep the printing presses running, to paper over the crisis with even more fiat currency. But without the Saudis forcing the world to buy that debt, printing more money simply accelerates the death spiral. That is the literal definition of hyperinflation. The experts on financial television will tell you the system is resilient. They are lying to you. The algorithm has found the glitch, and there is absolutely no mathematical escape velocity from this specific trap. I watched the digital price tag on a bag of flour tick up another 15 cents while a mother reaches for it. The violence of this economic collapse is entirely silent, but it is bleeding the middle class dry by the millisecond. This is not a temporary market correction. This is the structural floor of the American standard of living rotting away. The unearned privilege of holding the world's reserve currency is over, and the bill for 5 decades of infinite printing has finally arrived. You are standing at ground zero of a slow-motion financial apocalypse. The checkout counter is the new front line of a war that was lost the moment that 50-year security pact expired. We built an empire on a bluff, assuming the world would never call our bluff. But the cards are on the table, and the global south is simply walking away from the casino. The question is no longer if the American century is ending. The only question left is how much of your wealth will burn in the transition. The fire we are watching burn through your savings is not a temporary market anomaly. It is the final algorithmic run on the bank, playing out in real time across the globe. Look at the split screen of our new reality. On one side, the aging mechanical ticker of Wall Street is slowly grinding to a halt, choking on its own debt. On the other, a digital sun rises over a multipolar world. Asian markets are already clearing billions through decentralized wallets before New York even wakes up. As your professor in this autopsy of American hegemony, I must dispel one final illusion. The history books lied to you about how superpowers collapse. There is no cinematic invasion. There is no dramatic raising of a foreign flag over the Capitol. Empires do not die in a single day. They fade as the math slowly turns against them. The petrodollar era did not end with a military defeat. It was quietly dismantled by a decentralized, multipolar financial matrix that simply stopped caring. We spent 50 years operating under the arrogant assumption that the world had no choice but to use our money. That axiom is dead. By 2026, over 50 sovereign nations have initiated bilateral trade agreements that bypass the United States dollar entirely. They are settling accounts in yuan, in rupees, in gold, and in blockchain-verified digital currencies.
The fundamental gravity of global wealth has shifted eastward, leaving us stranded with trillions of worthless notes.
Look at the timeline we just uncovered. In 1971, we severed the dollar from physical reality. In 1974, we built a geopolitical hostage situation to hide the crime. For 5 decades, we forced the developing world to subsidize our suburban comfort. But the laws of mathematics are indifferent to American exceptionalism. You cannot print intrinsic value out of thin air, and you cannot weaponize a currency without forcing the entire globe to build a bypass road. The illusion has been permanently dispelled. The era of unearned economic privilege, where we could simply print our way out of any domestic crisis, is officially over. In this brutal new reality, the wealth of a nation is no longer dictated by a 50-year-old bluff backed by aircraft carriers. It is dictated by raw production, industrial capacity, and undeniable mathematical truth. If you do not produce tangible goods that the world actually needs, your printed paper means absolutely nothing. As we pull back from the trading floors and server farms, looking down at the Earth spinning silently in the dark of space, the terrifying scale of this transition becomes clear. The planet is entirely indifferent to human economics. It does not care that a massive financial empire is collapsing under the weight of its own hubris. The global South is simply rewiring the nervous system of human commerce around a dead organ. We are no longer the center of the world. We are just a local market. This is your final lesson. You are walking into a decade of severe economic contraction, and the safety nets you were promised do not exist. Your retirement account, your purchasing power, and your standard of living are tethered to a sinking ship. The math is executing its final subroutine, and no politician in Washington can vote away a mathematical certainty. You must stop waiting for a rescue that is never coming. You have to adapt to the raw physics of this new financial matrix. I built this investigation because the mainstream financial press is willfully blind to the algorithmic run on the bank. If this analysis shattered the illusion of the fiat system for you, hit the like button. That is the only real metric that tells me we are digging in the right direction. Subscribe to the channel to continue this research. The global economic architecture is being rewritten daily, and we are going to decode every single blueprint they try to hide. The secret handshake that bought the world has finally let go. We built a breathtaking illusion of infinite wealth, a 50-year paper empire that defied gravity until the equations simply refused to balance. Now, the math is settling the ultimate ledger, and the reality of 2026 requires absolute intellectual clarity. The illusion is dead. The truth is mathematical. Your final exam begins tomorrow. Class dismissed.